everyone. We're going to work with we've got our last panel between you and lunch. Okay, as Andrina mentioned, this morning is really, we are focusing in on policy, and one of the reasons we chose that was for many of the work that we have been involved in and hearing about your work, that in many cases, without the policy, we really can't move forward. And so we really run into this dilemma of really wanting to do the practice, and yet if we don't have the teeth of the policy, we can't move forward. And then we get caught in the policy and it keeps us from moving forward. So we get into a tension back and forth on that. And so we're going to kind of dive into this a little deeper. And so we've got Aline Juerges from the European Commission, Rhianna Rogers from the US Department of Treasury, Orla Lynch from the Department of Further and Higher Ed Research, Innovation and Science in Ireland, and Borhene, we've heard from him already, but we're hearing from him again from UNESCO. Oops, see if I can do this gracefully. And so let us start. So the question that I'm going to begin with is that, we've been talking about these four themes of validation and the individual, validation and skills, validation and inclusion, and validation and mobility. And so really thinking about the development of policy over time, thinking about how policy has been working to support these, and also if there's some places where it hasn't been supporting as much. And maybe we could start actually with you, Orla.
Okay. I suppose I begin by saying that I'm speaking as a policymaker, so please don't think I'm speaking on behalf of our new minister on any of this, but we do prepare policies for the minister, and I suppose I'm bringing that perspective today. The other thing I'd like to say before I speak is that we're a small country, and so, some of the discussion up to now, there's a sense of kind of a tension between policymakers, individuals, institutions. I like to think that in Ireland, we work in more of an ongoing dialogue, and certainly if we were to step ahead with a policy on RPL, we would do it hand in hand with the sector, with the practitioners. We couldn't do it without them. So I don't think it's policy v practice. And the third thing I'd say is of funding. We're very autonomous institutions, so we don't get into very transactional spaces around funding. So the idea that we would get very transactional around RPL funding, I think a lot of institutions would perceive that as some kind of encroachment on autonomy. So in that context, from a policymaker's perspective, RPL is a very important element of the education, the learning system, for a whole host of reasons, and you've been hearing a lot of and I've been hearing a lot about them today. We talk about inclusion, and inclusion is often seen as a social policy, but in fact, it's an economic policy as well. I think many of our workplaces are realizing now that they're missing out on a lot of talent. And also there is a question around diversity, certainly in some professions emerging. So I think inclusion is an important purpose for RPL for us. Also, economic policy, obviously skills policy, the massive changes that we're all facing into around technological advancements, but also the green transition, people having to kind of change careers. And then you have the social, obviously, agenda that we want to be fair, that we want to give everyone a good shot in society, that we want everyone to have opportunities to succeed. So RPL makes sense in that it's positioned in a landscape around, cluster of things like learning outcomes, qualifications frameworks, micro-credentials, recognition. They kind of sit together, often loosely labelled under lifelong learning. I'm not sure that's always helpful. It's just learning and good policy around learning. In terms of Ireland, we're lucky, I think we've one of the oldest qualifications frameworks in the world, and RPL has been right in the middle of that framework from the outset. So we have that for about 20 years. We have great networking. We're a small country, so we've enabled to be joined up, and we've the RPL network. And then we have some very good practices, both in our FET side, in the ETBs, and in higher education, and some recent very interesting initiatives around the human capital projects, particularly an RPL dedicated project, and also a My Pathways project that kind of embeds RPL in a more holistic system. I don't know if you've heard about that over the last couple of days. So I guess from a policymaker's perspective, RPL is an essential part of the system. It's something we've tried to encourage and foster, but I would acknowledge maybe quite in an informal way up to now, notwithstanding its inclusion in the framework. So there is a question now, where do we bring that now? Maybe I'll talk about that in a minute. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And hearing, we kind of have a diversity here on our panel in terms of, two countries, but also looking at it from a more global perspective and a European perspective. So, Aline, could we go to you next?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, as you just said, we are a very diverse panel here, and I would just like to give, a short reference to the overarching social policy agenda of the European Commission, because I think this also triggers down on what we're doing in skills and validation. So just for you to know that we have the European Pillar of Social Rights, and this is really important. It's an important compass for us for developing our social policy, and has consequently also a focus on skills and validation. For us, so I'm working in a unit which is dealing with the skills agenda, just for you to understand. Everybody has, there's one principle of this European pillar, and this is that everybody has the right to quality and inclusive education. So more or less in line with this SDG 4, I would say. So that is really, I think, important for us. We also have a target which we want to reach by 2030, which is that we have 60% of adults in training every year. So this is really a wake-up call for adult learning, for investing in adults much more. And so at my level, at our level, where we work more on skills and validation, I mean, you've heard from Ernesto already all the work we have done on validation. We have an inventory, we have the guidelines, which also put a focus on the individual. But just to give you an example of one of the flagship initiatives we have in the European Skills Agenda, and this is actually one initiative which puts the individual in the driver's seat of his learning pathway, and these are individual learning accounts. We have heard about Korea, I think, yesterday, and I think this is a really an initiative which is really very inclusive, which is looking at the individual. It provides money, financial support to increase really the motivation of individuals to engage in training. Because as you know, adult learning, to get 60% of adults into training by 2030, we are currently standing at 39%, so we have a long way to go. And it's always the question also, how do you motivate adults? It's really a very difficult question. And I think this is something which we need to be looking at more often. In relation to that, because there was also the mention of career guidance by Iceland, I think the ILAs are really, that's at least what the European Commission has, or the Council has proposed in the recommendation. These ILAs should include guidance and validation opportunities. So somebody who would like to use this account should really get help from somebody, from a guidance counselor, you know, to really explain to him, how do I actually use this money and for which training, and, you know, could we just make a little assessment? And he could also use it for validation. So you see that validation is really linked to a number of different policies, and I think that's one really key action what we are proposing. Just for your information, there are now 15 member states that are using EU funds to develop such an ILA. But just to come back to validation, more specifically, I think that we have made tremendous progress in validation. I think it's mainly due to this council recommendation, which was already mentioned before. And what is perhaps interesting to note in this inventory, which Ernesto was talking about, which we developed together, and which really gives a very good overview of what's happening at European level in 3 different contexts. So 32 country systems are analyzed. So it's rich, you know, you have a lot of information about it. But just to give you an information about the trends, because that was mentioned, that was noted, that the highest increase in validation was actually happening in the labor market. So this is just, you know, just to set a bit the context, because as you may know, I mean, the EU is very concerned by labor shortages, skill shortages. You mentioned already the green transitions. So I think this is something which can be explained maybe through the skill shortages Europe is facing, that there is such an increase in the labor market. Okay, let's stop here now.
Okay. Rhianna, why don't we turn to you? And I know you also, I should be using the mic, sorry. I also, before you were with the U.S. Department of Treasury, you were with RAND Corporation. And so you were looking at things also from a much broader perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Nan. So I'll start off by saying, because I am a presidential appointee, I'm speaking on my behalf and not on the President of the United States. So there are 4 entry points that I want to highlight about my personal experience here. As a student, I actually took part in CBE in the United States. I clept out of all of my U.S. history. I'm actually an archaeologist by training, so I've always loved history. But there's also, as a researcher, I came in doing tribal politics. So I actually was the Seminole Tribe of Florida tribal archaeologist. I also have an entry point as an educator. So Nan and I have worked together for about 15 years now. And I was actually overseeing the socio-cultural engagement and civic engagement piece of the Global Learning Qualification Framework. So during that process, we looked at 90 qualification frameworks across the United States and internationally. So it's been great to hear about how much the qualification frameworks have advanced on a global level. The other place I would say, too, and Nan just mentioned this about the RAND Corporation, is I oversaw all equity work. I had a $150 million portfolio of equity research in the U.S. and abroad, where I looked at education intersectionally prior to moving to the Treasury. So I'm just going to frame this by research from Illumina Foundation, which I think is important to say. The U.S. economy, by 2025, will need 160 million Americans with post-secondary degrees. We're nowhere near that, and we're 1 year away from that point. And one of the reasons why we aren't near that is because of a couple of structures in the United States that I think we need to work on. First and foremost, for those of you who don't know, even though I work at the federal government level, states' rights allow you to implement policies at different levels. And so one of the struggles is that we have a certain number of states, I'll just list a few, Minnesota, Hawaii, Nevada, Idaho, North Dakota, for example, but there are a few others, that have developed PLA policies. It is not universal across all 50 states, and it doesn't exist in the territories of the United States. So what that means is we struggle as a country where, I can tell you this because I went to 4 different undergraduate institutions that were in 3 different states. I couldn't transfer courses across my institutions. And that's difficult. If you can't transfer a course, which is traditional credentialing, imagine what that means about credit by evaluation. And so when I was in SUNY, so I worked at the SUNY system, one of the things that I thought was really innovative about SUNY is they started to create opportunities for equitable credit-bearing courses to transfer. That was actually a novel idea that's happened. It shouldn't be. And one of the struggles is that because of these individualized systems that exist, there are these struggles. So you can't transfer from, let's say, the California system, the UC system, to the SUNY system. And you can't transfer from the SUNY system to the CUNY system. And so there's all these layers of systems, not just the federal system, there are state systems, and these things need to do a better job of interlinking and cooperating together. The other thing I would say, too, is that there are some blockages that exist for equitable access to individuals, including financial access. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, not all PLA, CBE programs are created equal. Some cost a tremendous amount of money to actually go through the process and take a significant amount of time. As a result of that, it makes it inequitable for those who might not have access to it. I'll give you an example of myself as a student. I had never heard of CBE until I was a professor. Never heard of it. I didn't know. I actually went to, and Nan doesn't know this, the reason I came to Empire State was I was already teaching in Florida at an institution that did PLA. It was the first time I was evaluating PLA. This was back in the early 2000s. And I actually wanted to find out what was one of the oldest institutions, so I only applied to Empire. That was actually why I moved to New York, because I wanted to learn more about the methodology behind it. Because I recognized in the work that I did that this gave more equitable access to individuals. But as I dug deeper into my work around this area, I saw a lot of issues. I'll give one example. While at Empire, I tried to build a global Indigenous knowledge certificate program. And what I wanted to do is I built a course that was called Building the Indigenous Knowledge PLA. And I wanted it to be novel. I wanted it to not focus on some of the many issues that you've all talked about, where you are saying for some other group that you can speak on their behalf. I actually worked with SUNY to build in elders as the evaluators, not professors. It took 9 years for me to get this through the system. It took 9 years. Because there was no infrastructure that existed to support an alternative credentialing process for elders. Now, we have this, and I've already told Nan that I want to use this process as an example in other places in other states, but here's the thing. We just mentioned that SUNY is one of the most advanced in the sense of credentialing, and it still took me 9 years. So what does that mean for a place that is remote, that doesn't even have the structure? And this is kind of one of those barriers that I'll come back to as we continue talking.
Okay, great. And then Borhene?
No, thank you. I would like to mention a few aspects regarding the complexity of the interplay between the global agendas, the regional and the national agendas, and the asset, but also the limitation. Let me start with the anecdotal situation which we had when we adopted the Global Convention on Higher Education, on the recognition of higher education qualifications. At the time, we introduced it in the text the validation of prior learning as a model or as a mode of access to higher education. And few countries, without naming countries, few countries said, no, we don't have validation of prior learning in our system. We don't want to have it in the text. And other countries were saying, no, but we have it, and we are implementing it. And it's important that we start having it. It's maybe you will not be able to implement it immediately, but it has to be in the agenda. And we managed to have the validation of prior learning as one way of access to higher education and recognizing higher education qualifications. Today we have 28 countries that ratified the Global Convention, and we have around 30 countries that are coming into the convention. So in a way, we managed to set a global agenda on validation of prior learning through this negotiations among countries at the global level, and the countries who have ratified the global conventions are from low-income countries like Cape Verde and Cote d'Ivoire to most advanced economies like Australia and France. But it's also very small higher education systems like in Andorra or the Holy See, and very large systems like Japan, with more than 4 million students. So I think the global agenda can advance the national agendas and put them in this perspective of evolving. The second point that is important in the interplay between the global, regional, and national is that, as we mentioned earlier, for example, the adoption of the Sustainable Development Agenda 2015 is an important trigger for national policies. And we have seen countries, in the beginning, to be very clear, most of OECD countries were feeling that this is not an agenda for us, it's an agenda for the others. But with the time, with the crisis, with the also better understanding, it became part of the agenda. And RPL, VPL, wherever the term is part of this agenda of development, be it sustainable development, be it SDG 4 when it comes to education. And that leads me to the third point, which I think you mentioned, is that we need to think about system-wide and system-deep approach. And system-deep is, okay, validation of learning has to be part of a qualification, maybe agenda, a career guidance and counseling, a lifelong learning perspective, the lifelong learning entitlements, as we see in Europe, in France, we mentioned Korea, Singapore is another country, and other countries that are coming, even in the US, the Washington State. So there are initiatives that are in a way putting the right to lifelong learning as part of the national laws and validation of prior learning at the center of it. So there is the system deep, but the system wide is this connection between an education or lifelong learning policy and social security policy, economic policy, regional development policy. So we need to take that interplay as well between, I would say, a public policy and a whole of government approach that has to take that into consideration. Maybe the last piece that I would like to mention is that, and the interplay between the national and the global, is what I would say, how we set RPL and VPL in a rather broader goal or a cause. For example, we spoke about sustainable development. We have an agenda on issues related to digital divide. So how VPL can advance and address the digital divide across and within countries. How we mentioned indigenous knowledge. We have a decade of indigenous languages, and it's very important. Indigenous knowledge goes hand in hand with indigenous languages. So how we can use VPL as part of this global cause. We have 750 million illiterate persons. According to the World Bank, we have 1.5 billion low-skilled persons who may lose their jobs. Yes. So how we put VPL, in addition to an individual journey, maybe localize it, is also how we bridge and we make a hook with a broader cause. And it can be at the national level. You mentioned the 160 million. Where you will find them? You have to have not only a pipeline approach, but also lateral, much more flexible access. And VPL allows that. Thank you.
So I think you're bringing up, and all of you brought this up, and we've heard it in the previous work as well, is that this is so not in isolation. And when we really start to look at the development of policy across countries, within a country, and all the way down to kind of regional and local, and I realize this is not a question I had asked you previously, so this is kind of off the cuff. But in what ways could we really be supporting policies to really make those connections, where this isn't policy for RPL and then policy over here for something else, but really making those connections? So would anyone do you want to start on that?
There's a lot going through my head just listening to people talking, and I think one of the things you always have to do is go back to the individual person, and think it through from their perspective. And one of the things we know from all the data that we see is that the people with the most experience in education derive the most benefit from it. That is borne through in study after study. So when we talk about learners, I sometimes even move it outside of that and talk about the person, because I think there are a lot of people out there who don't see themselves as learners, but who are learning. We're all learning. We're all learning today. What education does is it structures and scaffolds that learning journey for a person. And I can't help but imagine how stressful a learning journey is without that structure and that scaffolding. And there are a lot of people out there, for instance, we know people in Ireland with upper secondary education, only 4% of them engage in what we call lifelong learning. So they see themselves outside the system, and yet they're learning. So it's to try and find a way, and I think find a way that everyone plays to their strengths. It's that complementarity between international, European, national policy, institutional policy, that can be kind of, and working well with people like employers, with people like community workers, to ensure that the incentives are there and crowd together to encourage people to see themselves as learning and to get into the learning system. There will be a cost. It will mean that we will need to systematize this, to make it more external facing, to make it look and feel more like a service for people, maybe something that isn't so bound up in the language of education and learning, because some people find that off-putting. And I think that's maybe where we need to think about going with this next.
Great. Rhianna?
Yeah, I want to highlight a couple of things. 2 articles. So in PLAIO, which I would encourage you all to read if you haven't. In 2015, I wrote an article working with NAN related to the GLQF. And I want to highlight some of the findings from that research where we did a case study. The vast majority of individuals who joined my case study were underrepresented. So invisible, visible disabilities, individuals coming from minority backgrounds. And one of the first things that they said is that they do not reflect themselves in the traditional education system because they don't often see themselves reflected in the room. And even if we look around in this room, we don't often see equitable representation of people. And inside of this particular case study, I focused on one student, Norma, who rose kind of to the top. And she said in her community, education was for them, not for us. And it took, and she actually mentioned this, so she went through working with me. She said it wasn't until she saw me give a keynote in a community that she ever saw a person who looked like me with a doctorate in her whole entire experience. And so recently I just gave a talk for the CALE, so the Council on Adult and Experiential Learning, where I was speaking with CALE and I said, you know, they interviewed me back 10 years ago. And they said, how would it be, because I did a report on Latina experiences, how would it be that we increase minoritized peoples in representation? And I said, you have to include more people that look like those populations. And you have to scaffold opportunities for individuals to get accredited, educated, so that they too can bring along their communities, which is a really critical point. We often find that in PLA, and I've heard this from many, many studies from a variety of people, that you see lower representation of minoritized groups as a result of them not feeling that their knowledge is valued and that their way of knowing will be accredited. I think another piece too, and I'm going to bring this up from RAND. So RAND does a lot of research about stackable credentialing. And so there's an article called Stackable Credentialing Pipelines and Equity for Low-Income Individuals. And so I funded this research when I was still there. And a couple of points that I want to highlight that they specifically found in this study is that low-income certificate learners, if you highlight certificate availability because they are micro-credentials, are more likely to sustain to complete their degrees. One of the things that we struggle with is we often think from the dominant population that getting a full 2, 4, 6, 8-year degree is the route. But that is not what we're finding in the data sets. Small micro-credentials work for those who have been marginalized because it allows them to complete in smaller blocks. Another thing I would highlight too is that economic returns increase by allowing those small incremental blocks inside of lower income populations. And this is really critical because right now, I would encourage all of you conducting research, we need more research to validate that in international contexts. We only had a few that were underway at RAND when I left, and it wasn't across all spaces. So we just mentioned from colleagues sitting over at the table about Ireland and the Roma, so traveler communities. We don't have enough of diverse tribalized peoples from around the globe to know if that would help those populations. Another final thing that I would say is there are limited opportunities of stackable credentialing that exist in any of the contact research that I find. Oftentimes, as I just mentioned to you, you might be able to stack something, but only in a particular institution. And those stacks don't move to other spaces. And as a result, as I just mentioned to you, these micro-credentials that work for marginalized peoples are not fulfilling the needs of those peoples in ways if they have to move. So think about migratory individuals. Yeah. They may not stay in the same state or region or location. And if they cannot bring those micro-credentials with them, then we're obviously going to be limiting their economic viability.
Yeah, I would like to do share kind of a very brief foresight exercise that I'm not speaking also on behalf of Guterres, neither our Director General, but more kind of foresight based on what I see globally. Let me say there is a first scenario which is like a status quo scenario where in reality VPL comes like a complementary to a formal qualification system that is well established. And in a way, that scenario can be, in a way, supported, given that there are heavy institutions, conservative perspective, and we see, in particular, in higher education institutions. So that scenario could be, and probably could be in some countries. The second scenario is much more, I would say, integrated approach of VPL in the national qualification system, and some indicators for that. We just published the Global Inventory on Qualifications Framework with the colleagues at CDFOP and ETF, and we have around more than 100 countries that are developing qualifications framework, and in most cases, those qualifications framework do include a validation of learning. So much more legislation, as Ines was mentioning in the case of Europe, but more, and that could be maybe more reasonable scenario. But there could be a disruptive scenario, and that scenario is VPL becomes at the center of any lifelong learning policy and any economic and social justice policy. And what defines that? There are 4 aspects that I would like to mention. One of them is that as we move forward, and we would like to capture learning happening in different contexts, anytime, anywhere, probably the learning records, and that's the work that is started in Europe. There are also initiatives, the Lumini Foundation, the Credential Engine in Australia, the platform on learning records. So more and more countries are adopting a system that not only will include formal credentials, but also other forms of learning. And VPL becomes very critical because that's the connectors across different learning settings. The second is technology. Technology is helping us more and more being able to record our learning in different ways and having that possibility for portability across different ecosystems, from workplace to formal learning, from formal learning to community learning. So technology will be very important. And the last aspect is the labor market is changing very fast. And we will need to have a much more flexible and much more agile system of recording the learning and making it visible. And we cannot afford. We see how artificial intelligence is hitting the economies and jobs. We see also the labor shortage. So probably there are solutions that will be established. And maybe it's kind of an advanced scenario, but this can happen because the system changes are also rapid, and we need to adjust to those adjustments. So I can see these 3 scenarios where status quo scenarios where we can continue with what we are having, basically a maybe more integrated scenario where VPL is much more central into the qualification system, and maybe a scenario of disruption where VPL becomes the instrument because we are working on learners' records and no longer only on credentials aspect.
Fantastic. And Aline?
I'm really impressed because I didn't expect all these scenarios here, but I think that was very, very interesting. I don't know, I think we should also bear in mind, because I think that's what you were asking in the beginning, you know, what is needed actually to promote validation more and more. And I think and that's what is our motto at the EU. I mean, we really closely work in partnership. And we really try to, you know, in particular in vocational education, training and adult learning, we try to bring, you know, the stakeholders, the local, the national authorities, the businesses, the Chamber of Commerce, the employment agencies, bring together. There's another initiative which falls under the skills agenda. This is the Pact for Skills. And there you have all these different stakeholders talking to each other and identifying the skills needs in their sector and then developing a training solution together. And validation, I can tell you, is increasingly taken into account by these Pact the Pact for Skills members, because they are increasingly wondering, you know, how are we going to, you know, we can identify maybe skills, we can document, but how does it really work? You know, the certification, the assessment. And I think this is really, that's what I learned from the closing event of the European Year of Skills, which is actually closing tomorrow. You know, there's a big interest by the companies to get some help or support from the education and training institutions. So I think this is really a call to, you know, make this bridge and work together with them. And I think then validation would also be, you know, much more clear for the different stakeholders. And that's something I would recommend, you know, working in partnership, reaching out to companies, and, you know, make these bridges and these coherence, as Ernesto has said, between the different contexts where validation happens.
Okay, thank you so much. And so, you know, based on this, and we only actually have a few more minutes, but if we could have each of you just identify kind of maybe one or two places where we need to maybe be asking the questions. What are the questions we should be asking of ourselves in terms of the direction, in terms of how to bring this all together? And Rhianna, do you want to start that one?
Sure. I think one of the big things is norming and destigmatizing of ways of knowing. I think we have to be a lot more open to understanding the different lived experience of individuals, and that we have to be ready to scaffold those experiences and understand that our way of knowing may not be the way of knowing. It's the only way that we'll be able to credential much broader and to meet these expectations that we have on a global scale of the workforce, to help those that are going to be pushed out of their current jobs, and to find opportunities for them to upskill in new areas.
Okay, great. Why don't we just go right on the
yeah, I would say, you know, it's important to democratize learning, but also maybe, you know, employment. I think that, you know, we have had these 4 keywords in our discussion, but I think it's also very important that people find decent work and get into a job. I mean, we have, you know, unemployment, we have people who are outside the labor market, and I think you can also get recognition through your job. Basically, and I think that needs to be said too. So that's, I think, my conclusion.
Okay.
No, thank you. For me, there are 2 points. One is more technical, and the other one more global political. The more technical, I think, is the return of the systems and the return understood in a wider benefit, because there could be benefit for economy, for society, for individuals. So I think that understanding and more evidence, more capacities to report on returns, and I'm putting them in a plural, will be very important. The second is, I think VPL again has to be placed in this broader sustainable development agenda. It's not useful for us to have a validation if this is something that will harm further our environment. So I think we cannot look to the right while we need to look to the left, because we need to understand what is happening there. We are speaking about indigenous knowledge and decolonization, for example. This is a matter of concern. we are speaking about peace and intercultural dialogue, and we are in the room more than 30 countries. But in reality, when we take it to a global level, we have to speak to more than 200 countries with cultures, with the religions, with the languages. And that inclusive approach cannot be only at the community level, at the national level. It has to be at the global level. So that divide is something that we need to take into account. And unfortunately, the digital is rather not an equalizer, but more a divider. And I think we need to be careful with it.
Great. And Orla?
I think a lot of what I've said has been covered by the three other speakers. I think it is a matter of awareness raising, the value, the power of this, of validation prior learning, recognition prior learning, the hard work that the practitioners do on the ground, speaking the language of policymakers. That's not to say changing what you're doing. It's about maybe looking externally a bit more in terms of how that looks to an outsider and talking the kind of language and recognizing whether the objective is economic, whether it's social, whether it's about sustainability and change, that all of these things matter. It's not one versus the other. And I think that idea of thinking about the individual and how you can talk to people and bring people into this and what kind of incentives people need to come in to RPL and maybe what you have to accept in terms of maybe, you know, moving it into something, as I said earlier, that looks more like service. And even though that might make people who are very passionate uncomfortable, that is probably something that will open this up to much more people.
Yeah, no, I will not be speaking later. I would like to mention that the VPL Biennale is a global common good for us, and that is a treasure that we cannot lose. It's the unique platform where we are speaking about these issues. So my call on us, but on all the participants, is how we can make the Biennale much more impactful and more known, because what we are discussing is very important for national, for regional, for international community. And the outcomes of our discussion can bring much more impact outside of this room. So I would like really to value this, and thanks to the organizers, but it's very important that we don't lose the VPL Biennale. It's our common good.
Thank you. Okay, so we just have like a minute or two, but the question I have for folks in the audience is, from your perspective, what are some of the questions we should be asking? And we probably can take one or two people. I think we've got a roving mic out there.
People are hungry.
Uh-oh. We got it right over there. Martina. Good. Some hands over there.
Who was first?
By all yours.
I can, Yola, you're second. I'll down here. Thanks, Martina. I'm Grace Edge from the National Project here in Ireland in higher education. And some of the questions that I think we need to ask ourselves, if we're going to do things at a national level, at an institutional level, is who does the jobs in RPL? What are the jobs to be done? Who's going to resource it? And how is it going to be coordinated across the institution and then also at a national level? So I think we do need to move away from thinking that it's going to happen by osmosis, by sheer wish, by practitioners' passion, because we have all of that in spades. I think what we're learning in the Irish project is RPL doesn't cost a lot of money to do, And so I think we really need to debunk the myth and challenge that when we hear it from our colleagues that this is enormously burdensome and it costs a lot of money. It doesn't. So we're seeing really lean and agile models that have been developed here in Ireland, and we see them elsewhere. And so I think the challenge is it does cost a little bit of money, and how are we going to make the good work that's happening, how are we going to make that sustainable? And I would agree with Orla entirely about moving to that idea of service. I do not think it's a bad word or a dirty word. We are here to serve our communities. This is the service that they need. And how can we put it on a sustainable footing so that there's a clarity and a transparency for everybody and a continuity of that service? Because at the end of the day, we know it comes down to trust, relationships. These are the things that actually drive RPL. And so in order to deliver that service, I think we need to look at how we fund and manage those services. So they're my questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace.
And Fiola?
Well, that was actually what I also had in mind, so thank you for articulating that so beautifully. But just to add on to that, the question that I was thinking about is, we in Iceland, we participated in the KA3 project, Guidance and Orientation of Adult Learners. And one of the conclusions that we had there was for the outreach to happen, we have so many service providers doing different things. And the individual sort of sometimes is in a vacuum in one of the service providers, but then needs to go to another, and it becomes difficult to carry the story between, or to have it so that it makes sense to the ones who are seeking the service. So we came down to the conclusion in that international project that somehow formalizing cooperation between service providers is of importance. Of course, it is a political thing, you know, what kind of cooperation and how can we formalize it? Is it a contract? Is it in the law? Is it in the regulation? But I think it's extremely important, and we found that if we work in a vacuum and there's nothing that says that the service providers is to listen to other voices or the collective of interdisciplinary thinking, we're still just working in a vacuum. So I just wanted to ask, you know, how if we think about formalizing cooperation between service providers, so it doesn't just become a one person's responsibility to keep contacting, and then that person leaves and then everything is just down the drain. You know, how can we work on that from a bottom-up, top-down approach? Thank you.
Do we have one more? I thought I saw one over there. Yeah.
Yes. Evelyn, just introduce yourself.
Hi, Evelyn McGlynn. I'm a mature learner, and I'm currently doing an honours degree through the RPL process. So Orla, I just want to say, in particular, you were all absolutely brilliant, great panel. I just want to say that what you were saying is just so amazing. The learner's voice and the learner needs to be given awareness. Through my research, I'm finding that just people don't know what RPL is in an Irish sense and beyond. And I think that people need to be encouraged, motivated, have a call to action, that this is an amazing, empowering experience, which it has been for me. The priorlearning.ie and Grace and Maria have been amazing, but I think that it really now needs to be told to the people to come. This is brilliant and wonderful, it'll change your life. And so from the economic points that you all made about a greater citizen, a greater people, a greater health and awareness, I would totally agree. At nearly 60, it's completely changed my life. So I would just say, tell the people, you know, tell them.
So thank you so much. What I'm going to do is ask you, I really encourage you to jot down what are the questions that we should be asking, what are the things that we should be looking at, and put it on our wall of thought out there, because we really do also plan to do some follow-up with some of this. So if we could get your questions out there, then we can also do some other things over the next year. We're talking about how to keep the conversation going. And now I'm going to turn it, so once again, thank our panel, because they were fantastic.